So John McCain, some of you know that name, is U.S. Senator from Arizona for 31 years. He was the 2008 Republican Party nominee for president. He was a prisoner of war in Vietnam for 5.5 years. And from that experience, he had wounds that never healed. And that's why for all of his life, he walked with a limp. He was a graduate of the U.S. Navy Academy in 1958. This is something that he said when he graduated. He went to Pensacola, and he told an audience, or he wrote these words one time. He said, "To become an aviator and eventually an instrument of war for my country, I was a very young man entering a very exciting profession with few priorities greater than my own amusement. My interests then were focused more on cultivating the image of a naval aviator that strongly appeased to my vanity than on becoming proficient in my chosen profession and understanding the purpose and full meaning of my duty. I wanted to live a life of daring, brash, fun-loving flyer, indifferent to the hazards of the profession. I thought that image, which I doubt I ever perfected, would prove irresistible to everyone I knew, especially to the girls whose attention I so sought. There are compensations to growing older, but the late discovery that you were probably not quite the charming, irresistible young man you once believed you were, but rather shallow, conceited, and often stupid, is one of the things among them. In truth, the image I aspired to was in the end only irresistible to one person, to me, and it was a childish attraction." Wow, those are powerful words. As he grew older, he realized so much of his young life was only about him. You know, that self-centered attitude is one that many of us struggle with. And like John McCain, as some people grow older, maybe it becomes a little easier and they don't struggle with it quite as much. For some of us, we continue to struggle with it no matter how old we are. And I am one of those. I will admit that right up front. But for some people, particularly those who are in places of importance or authority, that attitude can grow stronger in life rather than weaker. People who draw a lot of others around them and get a lot of attention because of their position of authority, because of the importance that their position has, sometimes their lives grow more and more about them. One such person is King Saul in Israel, about the 11th century BC. And we've been studying this man's life. We've been studying the book in the Old Testament called 1 Samuel, which includes this man's story, the first king of Israel who was anointed by Samuel, a prophet and a judge of the nations, and became the first king. And he started out rather shy. If you remember, when he was appointed as king, he was hiding because he was too shy, too afraid of that position, too shy to step up and take that job. And yet God said he's the man for the job right now. And as time went on, though, as he won some victories, as his importance and power and authority increased, his life became more and more about him. And one story that brings that out, I think, really well is in 1 Samuel chapter 14, where this king makes a very rash vow or oath, and it costs him. And we want to see that story today. Again, it's in 1 Samuel 14. Like I've done, we're covering big sections of Scripture with this series rather than smaller sections. And so what I want to do is summarize the story and then go back and look at it again with some lessons that are there for us. So just a summary of the story. The background, if you were with us last week, you might remember this, but the Philistines, Israel's great enemy, and Israel were arranging themselves for battle. And they were on opposite sides of this ravine. That picture up there is that very place. Now, we don't know if that's exactly where they went down and up, but that is the ravine that the two armies were on the opposite sides of. I mentioned last week they could see each other. They could probably hear each other because it doesn't look like it's very far apart. But there are some steep rocks between them. And Jonathan, Saul's son, was one of the commanders in the Israelite army. And he said to his armor bearer, let's go over and see what's on the other side. And that's where chapter 14 begins. One day Jonathan, the son of Saul, said to the young man who carried his armor, hey, come, let's go over to the Philistine garrison on the other side. Let's go see what's going on there. Maybe he was tired of his father's indecision. Maybe he was tired of the delay that kept going on. Maybe he realized, as we saw last week, that his father was fearful of beginning this battle. We don't know, but he just decided to do that. And he was convicted that God could bring a victory, and God would bring a victory to his people, whether it was by the hand of one person or an entire army. In fact, in verse 6, Jonathan said to the young man who carried his armor, let's go over to the garrison of those uncircumcised. It may be that the Lord will work for us, for nothing can hinder the Lord from saving, whether by many or by few. And his armor bearer was right on with him there. The next verse, the armor bearer said, do all that is in your heart, to do as you wish. I am with you, heart and soul. And so these two decide together that this is where God is leading. They're going to go over there by themselves. And so they go down that ravine and up the other side to make an attack. And the passage says down one crag and up the other. I never understood this passage until last week when I saw a relief map of the area, and a terrain map, because when I hear people coming out of rocks, I think of rocks that rise above us. And some of you know where I grew up, and some of you know that Vitavue, Wyoming is one of my favorite places. The rocks go up, and when people come out of the rocks, they're coming down. And yet this story keeps saying Jonathan went up on his hands and knees out of the rocks. And I never understood that till I saw that picture. And I thought, oh, all of a sudden this thing makes sense. Not the picture, but I saw the map, and that made me look for the picture. And all of a sudden it made sense. So Jonathan and his armor bearer went down one crag and up another, and they had names. The name of the one they went up on the Philistine side was the Hebrew Hebrew word senna. Sorry about that. It means thorny, or maybe thorn bush. Now think about that for a minute. The crevice they crawled up was called thorny, and it's a crevice that you wouldn't want to be climbing up. In fact, Old Testament scholar Joyce Baldwin said, no one in their right mind would choose this one unless it was the only choice they had. But Jonathan didn't want to be seen, and obviously they could see each other. They were so close together across that valley. So he went down where he couldn't be seen in a crevice and came up another one where the Philistines would not expect him to be coming up. And he came out, and they saw him, and God had given them a sign for victory. And that sign came about that the soldiers just looked at him and said, well, come on up here. And so that's what they said. And so Jonathan and his armor bearer went on, and at that point in time began to strike some of the people there. And because of that, they were so surprised that there was a panic amongst the army of the Philistines. And not only was there that panic, but after that happened, an earthquake happened. Right at that moment, and that caused the panic to get even greater. It says in verse 15, there was a panic among the camp, in the field and among the people. The garrison and even the raiders trembled, and the earth quaked, and it became a very great panic. It was a panic, and it became a very great panic. And in fact, the Philistine army began attacking each other in the midst of the confusion because of Jonathan's surprise. Well, his dad responded to that in kind of an interesting way. Across the valley, they could see the confusion that was going on. They weren't too sure why. Saul did a really quick inventory of his commanders and found one was missing, his son Jonathan. And so he assumed that Jonathan had gone over there and decides now that they're in a panic, it's time to attack. And so the first thing he does is he asks the priest if this is the time to attack. And then he goes on the attack. Keep that thought. We're going to come back to that in a moment. And he moves for the battle. When that happened, a couple other things happened as well. Remember last week when the Israelite army realized they were completely outnumbered and completely outpowered. Remember that they didn't have iron weapons like the Philistines did. And they didn't have chariots like the Philistines did. When they realized they were completely outpowered, some people started deserting the army. And some of them started hiding in these crevices and in these bushes that you can see in that picture. Well, once they realized the tide had turned, they started coming out of hiding and increasing the size of the army and going into the battle when the confusion started. Not only that, but the people who had deserted and gone to the Philistine side because they wanted to be on the side of the winners went, oh, it's time to switch again. And they switched back to the Israelite side and started attacking the people that they were amongst. And so it says in verse 23, the Lord saved Israel that day as the battle pressed on. And so they won a great victory. After that victory, there was a cleanup operation that needed to take place. And they wanted to pursue, this was in Israelite territory, they wanted to pursue the Philistine army further to make sure they were out of the country, to make sure that those left were not alive. And so it was time to do that cleanup operation. And in the midst of that, Saul made a vow or swore an oath. I never knew the difference between those. A vow is something you personally make to God. An oath is something that you swear to do to other people, I guess. I don't know. But anyway, whatever word you want to use there, he swore this oath. And this is what he said. In the midst of that battle, he said, if anybody eats before evening on my army, they're going to be cursed. If anybody eats before this victory in the evening, he's going to be cursed. It's in verse 24. You can look at that. Jonathan didn't know about that. Remember, Jonathan had already gone ahead of the army over to the Philistine side. And he wasn't aware of that. And you can guess what happened, that when the army joined him and were pursuing, they came across a place where there were a number of honeycombs, and the army wasn't going to dare touch them. But Jonathan didn't know what had happened. So he took some honey and ate that honey, and it says that his eyes brightened. His strength returned, and he was able to continue in the battle with renewed strength because of the strength of that food. And so when evening comes, the Israelites had won a pretty good victory. They weren't done yet, but they had won a good victory. And evening hit, and these soldiers were famished. And so they took the spoil, the animals that the Philistine army had that they had captured, and they just dove in and started eating them. And ate them very quickly. Now, Saul decided, do we need to continue this battle through the night now that we've had something to eat? And so he said, we're going to continue the battle. And the priest pulled him aside and said, wait a minute, let's make sure this is of God. Let's inquire and ask God if this is the right thing to do. Well, God didn't answer. They got no answer from God whatsoever. Now, this has happened before. And when it's happened before, it was often because there was some sort of sin in the camp. And so Saul assumes that somebody in the camp has sinned. And he does exactly what Joshua did in a battle before. You remember when Joshua conquered Jericho, he told the people, God told the people, everything in that city is mine. Burn it as an offering to me. And there was one soldier named Achan who took some things. He found a block of gold and some clothes that he wanted to keep, and he kept those. And the next battle was a disaster. And God said, it's because there's sin in the camp. And they actually drew lots, and God showed them who the sinful person was. So Saul, without even asking God, just decides, there must be sin in the camp. Let's draw lots and figure out who the sinful party is. I want to know who this guilty party is, and guess who the lot lands on? Lands on Jonathan. And Saul says, he holds court here, okay? What's going on here? What have you done? And Jonathan basically says, I ate some honey. He never makes an excuse. He doesn't say, I didn't know about your oath or anything else. He said, I ate some honey. And Saul swears again, this time that he's going to kill his son Jonathan. Get rid of this evil. Fortunately, at that point, the army steps in and puts a stop to the whole thing and doesn't allow Saul to finish that. Well, that's where we're going to stop today, is on that part of the story. But I think there's a lot in here that can teach us some lessons, and that's what I want to spend the rest of this time looking at, because the lesson has to do with Saul's regression from appearing to do everything right, appearing to be a king that's doing what God wants him to do, to a point where his life was all about himself. And we saw some of that last week. Last week we pointed out the things that were keeping him from wholehearted devotion to the Lord. One was fear. He saw the size and weapons of the Philistine army. One was feelings of abandonment. He thought everybody had left him because a number of soldiers had left him. We saw some impatience last week where he just wasn't willing to wait on God and for God's timing. And we saw also what I called self-exceptions, that Saul thought he was above the rule of God. Because he was the king, he thought he was above that, and how that was harmful to him as well. And those things were the beginning. This week we're going to see even more of that regression. And we see it in three different things that really all point to one thing. The first thing we see it in is a rash vow. This rash vow, or this oath. It's an oath that cares only for his agenda and not for the army. You know, it was a very hard-fought, long battle, and he didn't allow them to have any food. If you look at verse 24 again, I briefly mentioned it. I want to point out something. The men of Israel had been hard-pressed that day, so Saul had laid an oath on the people saying, "Cursed is the man who eats food until it is evening, and I am avenged on my enemies." Now, they left out a word in a lot of the translations because it's so redundant. Put up the next one, Kathy. I want you to see a literal translation of what he said. "Until I have avenged myself on my enemies." You see the threefold repeat, me, me, me. It's all about me. And it's so repetitive they don't even translate it in some of the English translations. If you have a New American Standard or another very literal translation, it'll probably be in there. Until I have avenged myself on my enemies. This vow is all about me. It's complete self-centeredness. It's interesting that when Jonathan heard about that vow after he'd eaten some honey, and people said, "Wait a minute, your father swore this oath, cursed is anyone who eats." His comment was, "My father has troubled Israel." My father has troubled Israel. That's an interesting word to use because it's always used in a very special context, a very special way. I mentioned last week reading from the theological word book of the Old Testament. These are the guys that have all kinds of advanced degrees they're perfectly fluent in Hebrew, and they spend their life doing word studies, and sometimes they're very dry and technical, but other times there's just some amazing truths in what they bring out in their word studies. This is what that book says about this word trouble. This trouble reflects the social dimension of an individual's action. The social dimension. A person's negative action, and this word always has negative concepts, has a harmful influence not only on himself, but on others. A person can trouble another, or a person can trouble the entire nation, bringing either man's or God's judgment on others. Ahab and Elijah exchanged charges, each claiming that the other had brought the present trouble on Israel. If you remember the story of Elijah and King Ahab, Elijah, speaking God's word, said there's not going to be rain in this country for 3 years. And 3 years later, King Ahab sees Elijah, and guess what he says? He says, "There you are, you troubler of Israel," the same word. And Elijah says, "No, I'm not the trouble of Israel, you are. This drought became because of your evil." And they call each other a troubler, this same key word that reflects the social dimension of action. It affects the actions that affect others. And again, it's the same word that's used for Achan when he ignored the injunction against taking booty from Jericho and so brought defeat upon the entire nation. The negative impact of someone's actions on others. That's what this word means. And that's exactly what Jonathan said. My father has troubled Israel. He's brought this trouble on. In reality, it was Saul who was guilty and not Jonathan. I think God allowed that lot to fall on Jonathan to bring out, to reveal just how self-centered Saul really is. Because we see that in the way this works out. By the way, this rash vow was cause for another sin. Because when evening came and that army, it says they pounced on the spoil. They were so hungry. And all they did is they took those animals and they killed them right there on the ground and ate that meat. I don't know if they cooked it or not. It doesn't say. But the trouble was that they didn't drain it. And God very clearly says, don't eat the blood. And when they realized what they were doing, they brought in a big stone and they killed the animals on the stone so the blood could drain off. And they didn't eat the meat with the blood in it. But there's another sin that was caused by Saul's self-centeredness in this whole issue. So we see that self-centeredness in that rash oath that he swore. We see it again in his impatience, just like we did last week. Again, not waiting for the Lord. He asked the priest, is this the first time he asked the priest, is this the time to go into battle? And all the confusion was happening right across the valley where they could see it. And the Philistine army was panicking and began to kill themselves. And when the priest began to ask God, Saul just said, wait a minute, I don't have time for that. We're going to go. And if you read verse 19 and 20, it says, while Saul was talking to the priest, the tumult of the camp of the Philistines increased more and more. And so Saul said to the priest, withdraw your hand. And then Saul and all the people who were with him rallied and went into the battle. We don't have time to ask God. We just time to go. And off they went. And so once again, just like last week, we see that impatience is not willing to wait on God. It's interesting that Saul said, bring the ark of the Lord to me. And the old translations or the old manuscripts are a little bit confusing because some of them say, bring to me the ephod, which was the chest piece that the priest wore that had the implements in them they used to determine God's will. And some of them say that that's what they said. But the evidence points to the fact he said, bring the ark to me. And if indeed Saul had the ark there in battle, it's just another picture of his self-centeredness because he didn't learn the lesson from one generation before. Go back to chapters 4, 5, and 6. And if you remember that message, there was a battle when the Israelites took the ark into battle thinking this is going to help us win, but they just used it almost as a talisman, not really seeking God, and it turned into a disaster. And if that's what happened, you see even more of Saul's self-centeredness there. He's not about God, he's just about himself and about the battle. There's that rash vow, there's that impatience. The third one is jealousy. He still wants credit for himself. Just like we saw last week, Jonathan won the battle and Saul took all the credit. And he's doing that again this week. He wants all the credit. When he holds court and the lot falls on Jonathan and he determines that Jonathan is guilty, he swears an oath, you're going to die, Jonathan. Do you know what Jonathan's answer was? Here I am. If I must die, I'm ready to die. You can see that in the passage, I think in verse 44. I think any parent's heart would have broken at that point. Like, I'm not going to put my son to death. And yet that's not what Saul did. He said, God do to me even more if I don't kill you. There was no softness towards his son at all. There was just that jealousy of the one who won the battle and got the credit for it. Wow. So there's that rash vow that's all about him. There's that impatience that's all about him. There's that jealousy that's all about him. Ultimately, it's all the same thing. It's pride. That's ultimately what this is. It's come to the point where Saul's life is all about Saul. That's what it's come to. Saul's life is all about Saul. This chapter closes in kind of an interesting way. At that point when the army steps in and saves Jonathan, then the text goes into stories of Saul's future or later battles in his career as a king. And it summarizes a number of those battles there. And then it closes with this interesting verse, verse 52. It said, there was hard fighting against the Philistines all the days of Saul. And when Saul saw any strong man or valiant man, he attached him to himself. Now, when I first read that, I didn't think anything about it. But as some of the books I read pointed out, there's two problems with that. Number one is there was battles with the Philistines Saul's entire life. It's because he didn't finish the job. In fact, when his son Jonathan said, my father has troubled Israel, he said, now the defeat among the Philistines has not been great. If my dad would have allowed this army to eat and continue the pursuit, we would have finished this job, but we didn't get it done. And so, for the rest of Saul's life, he was paying the price for that, dealing with the Philistines all the way into David's reign. The Philistines were the enemies of the Israelites and a very powerful enemy. The other problem with that is Saul wasn't recruiting to God's army. He was recruiting to himself. Anytime he saw somebody that was a warrior that he liked, he brought him into his personal bodyguard. He recruited them, it says, to himself. Again, we see that pride where Saul is all about Saul. Contrast Jonathan to that. Contrast his son, because his son isn't anything like his father in this regard. Look at Jonathan. Jonathan sought the Lord. It doesn't clearly say that he did that, but when you read the early section of this chapter, you'll see that every step he took included God in the process. It included God in the process, and he had faith that God would win a victory for his people, as we pointed out. And God confirmed that faith with that earthquake. He sought the Lord. He won the battle with the Lord. He gave credit to the Lord. And even the army knew that. You know, when Saul swears he's going to put his son to death near the end of this story, and he says that. This is what the army says. The people said to Saul, "Shall Jonathan die, who has worked this great salvation in Israel? Far from it. As the Lord lives, there shall not be one hair of his head fall to the ground, for he has worked with God today." The whole army knew who brought about that victory. It was the hand of Jonathan, but it was God who did it. And when God won that victory in a way that he should get credit for, Jonathan didn't try to steal that. We see Saul stealing that often. Jonathan didn't do that. In fact, as we saw, Jonathan was willing to die for the cause. Well, if I'm truly guilty, here I am. You can put me to death. Wow, that's powerful. You know, if anybody had a reason to make himself an exception to the rules, like we saw last week, Jonathan had that reason. He was a royal prince. He was the heir to the throne, and he had just won a great victory. If anybody had a right to say, hey, wait a minute, he didn't even know the rule. I mean, if anybody had a right to say this shouldn't apply to me, it was him. But he was willing to say, okay, if that's what's required, here I am. Wow, that's not about himself. That's pretty powerful. I want you to compare that to a New Testament character named Timothy. Timothy was one of the Apostle Paul's disciples. And when Paul wrote to the church in Philippi, this is what he said. He wrote this from prison, so he couldn't go see them. He said, "I hope in the Lord Jesus to send Timothy to you soon, that I also may be cheered when I receive news about you. I have no one else like him who takes a genuine interest in your welfare, for everyone looks out for his own interests, not those of Jesus Christ. But you know that Timothy has proved himself, because as a son with his father, he has served with me in the work of the gospel. So I'm going to send him as soon as I can." Think about that for a minute. The credible words. Everyone looks out for his own interests, not those of Jesus Christ. But Timothy takes a genuine interest in you. You see, Timothy was about the things of God, about the people of God, where he wasn't about himself. Saul was all about himself. Made me think of two more kings, and have to give credit where credit's due, because when our small group Bible study met this week, we've been watching a series of videos from Focus on the Family called That the World May Know. They've been around forever, but they're still really good. And we watched the Christmas video that was put out by That the World May Know, which is a comparison of two kings. And when I watched that, I said, boy, this is exactly where we need to close this message this week, because the Christmas story that they present is two kings. One of those is King Herod, and Herod is all about Herod. Herod the Great on the pages of history. We know him in the New Testament from the one who killed the babies around Bethlehem. He built a palace called the Herodium. It may have been the largest palace in the world in its day. We don't know, because he was a contemporary of Julius Caesar and he was a contemporary of Cleopatra. And both of those had some pretty opulent things. But he built this palace, and the reason that picture's there is he built it on top of that volcano-looking hill. And it not only was on the top of that hill, it had a wall about 3 stories high around it, and it had towers above that another 2 or 3 stories. Huge thing. It can be seen from everywhere around. It's right outside the town of Bethlehem. In other words, wherever Jesus was born, they could see that thing, because it can be seen for miles. And the video makes the point there's 2 kings in this story. One is a king who's all about himself, and the other is a king born in his shadow. But that one is the true king. That one is the true king. And ultimately, he proved to be that. You know, Saul wasn't the true king. He was the one that people demanded, and God said, okay, here's your king. Herod wasn't the true king. They were both all about themselves. But Jesus is the true king who came and fulfilled God's purpose for him. He did not come to be served. He came to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. That's what this king came to do. He was all about others. He was all about us and dying for us. That's the king that's worthy to follow and worship.